War Pugs. It is a request from Sia in the Discord that has got my attention today. This is Potential Histories, Why Japan Surrendered. And to be perfectly honest with you, if you don't know, the amount of things that were actually... Some people think that, okay, we dropped the 2 bombs, they surrendered at that point. There was a whole lot more going on, okay? There was an attempted coup. There was a lot of talks continuing the war. The USSR invaded Manchuria, which they were just not prepared for. There was a host of problems. There were several Japanese officers that wanted to keep fighting, wanted to keep going. And there was, if you ever get a chance, listen in to a historical documentary about the coup that took place the day that Japan surrendered, because the whole night prior, there was a series of events where the actual ruling government had to hide a copy because the emperor had taped himself speaking. And they had taken that tape and had to hide it away from these officers that were trying to keep it from coming to public knowledge that the emperor was going to surrender. It was a whole event. I have no doubt that he's going to talk about this in there just based off the thumbnail. But, guys, this is Potential History. This is why Japan surrendered at the end of the day. And if you like this, just leave a like, a subscribe if you haven't already. Let's get right into it. It's Potential History. Let's go.
You ever heard of George Pickett? He was a general, perfume enthusiast, war criminal, and person in the wrong place at the wrong time, ordered to carry out the disastrous charge that would forever have his name attached to it at Gettysburg.
Yeah.
Post-war, there was a fascination in the U.S. over the defeat there. And, as you can imagine, Pickett was often asked what he thought was the cause of this huge defeat. But whenever
he pretty much blamed Lee. He blamed Lee a lot for this.
asked, his reply was always the same. I think the Yankees had something to do with it.
Now, where he got that from, that was something that he said a lot, but he did wind up blaming Lee in later life.
Let's talk about Japan. So if you know one thing about the Japanese in World War II, it's their reputation to not give up. From the individual to the unit to the government, holding out and preferring death to giving up. So it's kind of weird they gave up, right? Like, really, you could make an argument Germany held out longer and more in line with the stereotypical Japanese warrior spirit than Japan itself did.
True.
Japan even got like a semi-conditional surrender and peacefully welcomed an occupation. Whereas Germany... So how did that happen?
Yeah.
And that question, for some reason, has become this huge point of debate recently. Well, more like a year ago, but this is when I'm getting to it. And it's very dumb because it's turned into this monocausal debate of the true cause of Japan's surrender. But here we go.
Here we
there
go.
are 2 arguments. Most people believe that it was the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs that scared Japan into surrendering. That is this camp's be-all, end-all point, given that on August 6th, one was dropped, showing Japan that the U.S. had the capability, with the second dropped on the 9th, confirming that it wasn't some kind of one-off thing, and inferring that it could literally be done until there was no one left. Or they gave up. Simple cause and effect.
Bomb was finally released exactly at the designated hour, and the explosion occurred as planned.
The other big one is...
Yeah, there were some people who had a lot of issues. Not all the members of the Enola Gay that bombed Hiroshima had issues. The pilot was pretty much like, I'd do it again. I'd do it again and again and again and again. But others, I mean... It's a rare thing in history to know that you dropped the bomb that wiped out a city.
That Soviet intervention caused Japan's surrender. The story from that point of view goes, a bomb is dropped August 6th, Japan doesn't respond and doesn't care, but on August 9th, the Red Army invades Manchuria, and then the Japanese surrender, and they just kind of ignore the other bomb. Now, I'm gonna let you in on a secret. Both these takes are dumb. Seriously, whenever people discuss the surrender of Japan and make their case, it always involves the most flagrant use of cherry-picking I have ever seen and ignoring
Typically.
certain facts. And I'm not even including all the counterfactuals when you expand the conversation to the morality of all of it, which, to be extremely clear, is not what this video is about. This is a whole different conversation. We are just talking about what got Japan to quit. I'm not going into that. I mean, maybe one day if you ask nice enough. Now, for all of this to become super clear, all you need is a timeline of events and to work out how they interact with each other, while not leaving any of them out. By mid-1945, everybody in Japan knew how bad the situation was. Absolutely no one held out any hope for what could be called a victory in the traditional sense of the word.
Right.
There are no Steiner's counterattacks here. This is Japan in 1945. You are going to die. One thing often missed when talking about this was, at this point, that kind of victory wasn't the goal. The goal was really, at this point, just a negotiated peace to avoid utter defeat. And their plan for this was called Ketsugo. The general idea for it was to bleed the Americans until they gave up.
Right.
Now, this is not far off from what the Japanese had hoped to do pretty much the entire war. They were always realistic about the fact that as long as morale held, they were going to get trounced by the United States. But what began as a hope for an anti-war sentiment after Pearl Harbor was now taking its final form here at the end, with now trying to take as many Americans with them as possible and hope there's some Japan left by the time they give up. And this plan was going to be enacted during the American invasion of Japan they knew was coming. These policies were enacted by a council called the Big Six, made up of 4 Navy, 2 Army, and 1 civilian member that had to agree unanimously on all decisions for the nation. And they were very, very united in this policy. All of this is to say that Japan wasn't just preparing for an invasion, they were hoping for it. It was the goal. They wanted the Americans to come to them and make Okinawa look like a joke, so that those weak-willed Americans would leave them alone.
Yeah.
And Japan, although technically defeated in pretty much all its war aims, would still keep its institutions, government, and not be occupied. And until August of 1945, to the Japanese, it looked like that was going to pretty much have to play itself out. But then in the course of less than a week, all of that changed.
Yeah.
On August 6, 1945, Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima and destroyed it. But surprisingly, for being the first people to have the literal power of the sun harnessed against them, the Japanese response was actually pretty muted. The Big Six and the government were not really impressed at all. Japan had it.
You gotta understand, too, that the sheer fact of the matter is Japan had been firebombed to the point of absurdity for a while at this point. There were very few cities that hadn't been hit and just bombed into absurdity, and a lot of the structures for the houses in Japan were more or less paper based and burned. In fact, the reason that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were chosen as potential targets was because they hadn't had the absolute ever-loving crap firebombed out of them.
A nuclear program during World War II. Although it wasn't successful, it gave them a really good idea of how Herculean a task it was to create one of these things. And so for those who actually believed it was a nuclear device, they figured there was no way there could be more than one. The Army and Navy's opinions were even more extreme, with the Army flat out denying that it was a nuclear weapon, demanding more evidence, and the Navy essentially saying, "That's neat. Do it 5 more times and I might be scared." And as far as official responses from the Japanese government, there was nothing. Fast forward to 3 days later, the Red Army invades Manchuria with fantastic success, essentially rolling over the Kwangtung Army and its allies. As you can imagine, this was not ideal. Japan had been doing everything it could to not provoke the Soviet Union this entire war after 1939. And people in the Japanese government had actually been really hoping that the USSR might be convinced to mediate peace talks between they and the US. Peace talks with terms the US would never accept, but nonetheless. But although they were now fighting large country number 4 at this point, there was still no move to action from the government. Upon hearing the news, Army Chief of Staff, this guy, pretty much dismissed it out of hand, saying that, yes, this is an unwelcome development, but this does not invalidate Ketsugo, essentially saying, hey, if the Soviets want to land too, it's all killing allies to me. Then, no kidding, about 10 hours after the Soviet invasion begins, another bomb is dropped on Nagasaki, destroying it. But even then still, on the 9th, the Big Six cannot come to a unanimous decision for what to do. It takes until the next day, August 10th that an Imperial conference is called and Hirohito makes the decision to surrender, breaking a 3-3 tie on what to do. Now, this is normally where the retelling ends, but this leaves the situation far from sorted, as maybe the government decided to surrender, but what about the army? In fact, this whole war started because the army wasn't listening to the government in 1933. There's absolutely no guarantee that they're going to go along with this. In fact, right after the decision, General Kawabe's deputy chief of staff was asked by another senior general, what if the officers don't follow the order? To which he said without hesitation in his diary, yeah, a lot of them probably won't. And after that, just like he predicted, 2 of the 3 Japanese area army commanders, one in China and one in Southeast Asia, declared that they would not stop fighting. On top of this, there was actually a coup by a bunch of middle-ranking officers to steal the surrender declaration recording Hirohito made, and probably to kill pro-peace government figures and possibly even try to take control of the emperor himself. Now,
that was the goal.
The whole thing was horribly planned and had no chance of success, but it goes to show that the government saying, we give up, is not the end of the story. Skipping ahead, on August 15th, Hirohito's surrender declaration is played to the Japanese people. Now, it mentions only the atomic bombings and not the invasion of Manchuria by the Soviet Union. This has been used by those who argue the bombs solely ended the war as evidence for the fact that the Soviet Union played no part.
Right.
But it makes sense why he would only mention this to the Japanese people, who both had a frame of reference for it and were being affected by it.
Yeah.
The Soviet invasion of Manchuria would have meant nothing to them, and would not have made any sense as a reason to surrender, being something that was far off on the mainland. The opposite was the case everywhere else, though. Although Japan had officially surrendered, the army just flat out refused to stop fighting the Soviets in many sectors.
A really big thing about them, the Soviet thing, was they knew one thing above everything else. When they were looking about who they were going to surrender to and why, the Americans might keep the emperor and allow him to retain power. The Soviets would not, and it wasn't even a real discussion if the Soviets would or not. It was pretty much, yeah, we don't want to see the emperor get dragged out into the street and shot, which is, let's not kid ourselves. Would you really put it past the Soviets?
As you can imagine, would be a political nightmare, and could only go on for so long until your enemies just no longer believe that you're actually trying to surrender and start thinking that this was probably just some trick to buy time. So on August 17th, a shorter speech by Hirohito was given to call the military itself to surrender. And although the tone of both speeches are very similar, the call to action is over the Soviet intervention, with the bombs not being mentioned at all. But this also makes a lot of sense, because it is directed at people who aren't in Japan,
right,
and are bearing the brunt of fighting all these enemies abroad. To the individual commanders, hearing about Hiroshima and Nagasaki would have been an incredible non-issue given 2 things. One, cities have been destroyed before. This was another firebombing of Tokyo by a different name. They had to be thinking, we were fine with that when it happened. How is this any different?
Exactly.
They also have no concept of what an atomic bomb even is. So the magnitude of the event was just lost on them. And 2, Japan had already decided to fight this thing out till the end and rule over what was left. Since they were doing exactly that in the occupied territories, they 100% expected people to be doing that on the home islands. Mentioning the Soviet invasion implied that they couldn't really bleed the enemy to a stalemate anymore with a whole nother country arrayed against them. That kind of line of thinking utterly invalidates Ketsugo, and was really the only thing that would convince them to lay down their arms. Basically, at this point, there's so much against us, this stalemate, or this forcing the enemy to give up, just isn't possible anymore. You really see all of this play out post-war in memoirs for both points of view.
Right.
Generals abroad always say the surrender came from the Soviet intervention. Governmental figures, and those on the home islands, will say it was the bombs. And that gets to my point. There's no singular reason for Japan's surrender. In the course of 3 days, just 3 days, things went from a terrible situation with basically a national suicide pact to the sky falling, both figuratively and literally,
yeah,
where you were. And even after that, there were still significant holdouts. History is the study of cause and effect, but I think that people often want to make that a lot cleaner than it actually is. No event takes place for a singular reason, especially one as messy as this. So if I had to say why the Japanese surrendered in 1945, I think the Allies had something to do with it.
So, one thing that is just unbelievable about the whole string of events, that week period that he was talking about, that 1 week period that he was talking about. Ketsugo, if it had been enacted, if there had been an actual invasion of the Japanese home islands, the death toll would have been incredible. The level of destruction would have been unparalleled. It would have been, we would never be able to look back on that with anything other than, I would have to say we would have to look at it with a sense of shame, because why didn't we find another way to do this? Why did we have to go to this extent? Why did we have to go this far, this hard? Some of the training tapes they have of people undergoing training to be involved in the resistance of the invasion is actually kind of haunting to see, because people were ready. They were getting ready on the home islands to just go and die as well as they could. When he called it a suicide pact, he really wasn't joking. Japan was on another level. And it really does show just how resilient they were as a nation, as a collective civilization, to bounce back from something like this. Because, I mean, to go from that to what they are now is radically, it's a 180 degree turn. And they fully committed, after seeing what militarization had done to their country, to pacifism. And only recently have they begun changing that particular path, where they're starting, because of the threat of China, they're starting to look like they're starting to remilitarize. And I don't know how well that's going to go, or how responsive they're going to be to that. All things said, though, yes, this surrender happened because of so many different things, and even the major things, such as the bombs, the nuking of the invasion of Manchuria. Those happen on the back of a monumental amount of setbacks. And just to kind of hammer home the point about how much pride they had, when Hirohito announced the surrender, he said something to the effect of, the war has proceeded in a direction not necessarily to our favor. War Pugs, I'm glad that it didn't go to the extent it could have gone to. I'm very glad it didn't go to that extent. I'm glad that they are now our allies. I'm glad for a lot of things, but more than all, I'm glad this war ended without U.S. boots stepped on the mainland of Japan in anger. One thing that has always been clear is if that had continued to go on, if that had actually happened, the death toll would have been catastrophic by any means. War Pugs, I'm going to head out from here. Potential Histories links are going to be in the description down below. I highly recommend this channel to you guys. Check the links in the description below for mine as well. Join the channel as a Patreon or a member, and I will catch you guys next time.